was a different kind of war. One that would not bring total victory to either side. American troops, under the command of the United Nations and led by General Douglas MacArthur, finally trapped thousands of North Koreans in a successful invasion of Incheon. The Communists retreated above the 38th parallel. The United Nations gave MacArthur permission to pursue the fleeing armies toward the Yalu River, the boundary separating North Korea and Manchuria. China's Foreign Minister, Zhou Enlai, warned that his country would not tolerate an invasion of North Korea. Alarmed at the prospect of a massive Chinese counterattack, President Truman flew to Wake Island to meet with General MacArthur. The general convinced Truman the Chinese would not intervene, but he was wrong. Chinese troops soon drove the UN forces back below the 38th parallel. And by the spring of 1951, both sides were bogged down in what was to become a demoralizing stalemate. Determined to keep Korea a limited conflict, Truman refused MacArthur's request for weapons to bomb Chinese bases across the Yalu, and eventually recalled the American commander from Korea. Truman embarked on peace negotiations, but the process was slow and demanding. In 1952, General Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican presidential candidate, announced that if elected, he would go to Korea to break the stalemate. The Democratic candidate, Adlai Stevenson, could not match Eisenhower's immense popularity. Eisenhower visited Korea shortly before taking office. On his return, he issued a statement that suggested an even harder line if a truce were not quickly negotiated. The Communists resumed talks and finally signed an armistice on July 27, 1953, which preserved the status quo of a divided Korea. Truman's containment policy had worked, but at the expense of 142,000 American lives. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, brought a new aggressiveness to the Cold War. During the 1952 election campaign, the liberation of captive peoples under communist domination had been one of the Republican Party's foreign policy planks. Dulles believed the communists could be held in check by threats of massive retaliation against Moscow and Peking. The United States had developed a hydrogen bomb, a weapon more powerful than the atomic bomb. But within a year, the Russians had successfully tested their own thermonuclear weapon, resulting in a nuclear standoff. Yet threatening language continued on both sides. Brinkmanship was another of Dulles's controversial doctrines. America, he said, should not hesitate to go to the very brink of war if necessary. Yet on several crucial occasions, Eisenhower refused to risk a shooting war. In 1953, East Berlin workers rioted against their communist government. Their appeal to the United States for help went unheeded, even though Dulles had made a radio address to the people of Eastern Europe, suggesting they could count on American support. Despite Dulles's aggressive rhetoric, Eisenhower was a cautious and moderate man, an experienced military leader who had been swept into office on his pledge to bring peace to the country. At the same time, Stalin's death in 1953 suggested greater flexibility in Russia's foreign policy. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, seemed more willing to seek influence through political rather than military means. While the Soviets continued efforts to solidify their control of Eastern Europe and to extend their power in Germany, they spoke of peaceful coexistence. Eisenhower, too, extended the olive branch.
The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma.
In a dramatic appearance before the United Nations, he proposed sharing atomic energy for peaceful and industrial purposes with all interested nations, including Russia. The United States would make its atomic materials available through a newly created international agency. 3 years later, Eisenhower saw his Atoms for Peace plan become a reality. 70 nations, including Russia and other communist countries, signed an agreement that created an International Atomic Energy Agency. But international tensions continued, particularly in the Far East. With China now a communist state, every effort was being made to keep the rest of Asia in the Western camp. In Vietnam, America had been supplying French garrisons with military aid since 1950. China was supplying the communists, who had surrounded thousands of the best French troops in a military garrison at Dien Bien Phu. By the spring of 1954, the French position seemed hopeless. The French chief of staff appeared in Washington to plead for direct military intervention. Eisenhower, just 4 weeks earlier, had warned that the takeover of one Southeast Asian country by communists could start a chain reaction that would pull them all down like a row of dominoes. Yet Eisenhower refused to send troops. Dien Bien Phu fell, and the French accepted a compromise settlement which was signed at Geneva by China, Great Britain, and Russia. The agreement divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel. In the north, Ho Chi Minh became head of the new communist state. In the south, the Emperor Bao Dai ruled briefly until he was overthrown by his prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem's government was quickly recognized and supported by the United States. Other Asian trouble spots included Quemoy, Matsu, and the Tachens, a small group of islands off the coast of mainland China. They had been occupied by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist troops when Chiang had retreated to Formosa. Now Chiang's forces were engaged in a continuing artillery duel with mainland troops. When the communists began to occupy the Tachens, Chiang's troops, with the help of the United States Navy, evacuated the islands. On January 24, 1955, as the situation grew more dangerous, Eisenhower went before Congress and requested authority to use force to protect the nationalist Chinese. Congress responded quickly, and the United States 7th Fleet was stationed between Formosa and mainland China. The fleet was withdrawn when tensions eased, but the status of the offshore islands was left unsettled. In another effort to ease world tensions, Eisenhower, Prime Minister Anthony Eden of Great Britain, Premier Faure of France, and the co-heads of Russia, Nikita Khrushchev and Nikolai Bulganin, met in Geneva in July 1955 to discuss disarmament and the reunification of East and West Germany. Eisenhower surprised the world by suggesting that Russia and the United States open their skies to one another for the purpose of aerial photography. This form of arms inspection would protect each country from surprise attack. Although the open skies proposal appeared acceptable to the Russians at first, they later rejected it on the grounds that it would be an invasion of their sovereign territory. There were no significant agreements at Geneva. But the spirit of Geneva did lead to a temporary thawing of the Cold War. Another optimistic note was struck by Khrushchev early in 1956 when he denounced Stalin for his brutal rule and declared that war with the capitalistic states was not inevitable. People in the satellite nations of Poland and Hungary began to reappraise their country's relationships with Russia. In Poland, riots were quickly put down, but the Poles won considerable internal freedom from Russia as a result. Taking their cue from the Poles, the Hungarians launched an anti-communist revolution. They succeeded in overthrowing the government. Within days, 200,000 Russian troops invaded Hungary to brutally put down the rebellion. In the final days of fighting, the Hungarians broadcast appeals to the United Nations and United States for help. None came. In answer to critics of America's foreign policies, Eisenhower stated that liberation, as defined by Secretary of State Dulles, had never meant armed revolt. America's prestige, lost by Eisenhower's handling of the Hungarian crisis, was more than regained during a new crisis that quickly arose in the Middle East. Colonel Nasser, head of the new revolutionary government of Egypt, refused to join an alliance promoted by the United States, believing it a plot to divide the Muslim countries. In addition, angered by America's refusal to sell Egypt arms, he turned to Russia for military supplies. The final break with the United States came when Nasser recognized Communist China. Dulles reacted by withdrawing America's pledge of financial aid for Egypt's Aswan Dam. A week later, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. France and Britain had long considered the canal their economic lifeline to the Far East. When a compromise settlement was vetoed by Russia in the United Nations Security Council, France and Britain moved to retake the canal by force. At the same time, Israel attacked Egypt, moving her armor across the Sinai Peninsula. America's longtime allies, France and Britain, had not informed Eisenhower of their plan in advance. The angry president demanded they cease fire. Khrushchev applied equal pressure by threatening to send in Russian volunteers. With world opinion against him, Prime Minister Eden announced a ceasefire and a withdrawal. A United Nations emergency force moved into the area, and the immediate crisis passed. Eisenhower's firm stand won the respect of many of the Arab nations. He then moved to secure his advantage. On January 5, 1957, he went before Congress to ask for the means to counter communist infiltration in the Middle East. The result was the Eisenhower Doctrine. This gave the president authority to send financial and military aid to any Mid-Eastern country requesting it for help against communist aggression. This authority was used in 1958 when the pro-Western government of Lebanon was attacked by Nasser's supporters. Eisenhower sent American Marines onto the beaches of Lebanon to guarantee its security. As the Cold War spread from Europe to the Middle East, it also spread to Latin America. The United States was stunned at the extent of anti-American sentiment expressed during a goodwill tour by Vice President Richard Nixon. Nixon was met by open hostility, mobbed and pelted with eggs and stones wherever he went. Just 90 miles off the Florida coast, Cuba's dictator Batista was overthrown in January 1959, and power was assumed by Fidel Castro. Strongly anti-American, Castro surprised the United States by announcing that he was setting up a socialist state. He confiscated American property and moved to suppress all opposition. The most threatening aspect of Castro's regime was the move to export his revolution to other Latin American countries. At the end of his second term, Eisenhower severed diplomatic relations with Cuba. Another problem island, one set in the midst of a communist state, was the city of West Berlin. In November 1958, Khrushchev announced that if the status of West Berlin were not resolved within 6 months, Russia would make a separate peace with East Germany. This would give control of the city to the Russian-supported state. The Allies were alarmed, but stood united against this new crisis. Slowly, Khrushchev backed down, and the Russians suggested another summit meeting. Khrushchev's dramatic visit to the United States and Eisenhower's promise of a return visit were cautious moves toward closer communication. But just before a scheduled Paris summit meeting, the Russians shot down an American U-2 spy plane deep in Russian territory. In an unprecedented disclosure, Eisenhower admitted that American spy planes had been flying over Russia since 1956. Khrushchev bitterly attacked Eisenhower and angrily canceled the Paris meeting. As Eisenhower's second term drew to a close, efforts on both sides to moderate the Cold War appear to have failed. In a period of international crises, Eisenhower had kept his campaign promise to maintain peace, but many issues remained unsettled, and communism had spread to new troubled spots around the world.